Before the sun even touched the golden roofs of the palace, before the kingdom stirred awake, something deeply unsettling was already happening behind closed doors. The King of France, the most powerful man in Europe, was beginning his morning. But what that routine involved was something most people today would find shocking, uncomfortable, even disgusting. Because this was not just a private ritual, it was a performance, and dozens of people were invited to watch. But the truth behind these royal mornings is far stranger than you think, and far more revealing about power, control, and the bizarre world of absolute monarchy. To understand how such a routine became normal, we must step into the glittering yet suffocating world of the French royal court during the height of its power. This was a time when kings were not just rulers, they were symbols of divine authority. Their lives were not entirely their own. Every movement, every gesture, every word was carefully observed, recorded, and often imitated. And no king embodied this system more completely than Louis XIV, known as the Sun King. Louis XIV ruled France for over 70 years, transforming it into the most dominant cultural and political force in Europe. His palace at Versailles became the center of power, luxury, and influence. Nobles from across the country gathered there, not just to serve, but to be seen. Because at Versailles, visibility meant power. And nowhere was this more obvious than in the king's daily routine. Each morning, long before most people would even consider waking, the king's day began with a ritual known as the lever. At first glance, it might sound simple, the act of getting out of bed. But in reality, it was a highly structured ceremony involving strict rules, ranked privileges, and a carefully controlled audience. Because not everyone was allowed to witness the king wake up. Only the most important individuals, high-ranking nobles, trusted servants, and select courtiers were granted access, and even among them, there were levels. Some could enter the room early. Others had to wait outside until a specific moment. Every second was choreographed. The doors would open, the room would fill, and the king would begin his morning in front of an audience. Everything was about to unfold in a way that feels almost impossible to imagine today. The king did not rise from bed immediately. Instead, attendants would approach, speaking softly, announcing the time and preparing him for the day. Curtains would be drawn back slowly, allowing light to spill into the chamber. The king, still lying in bed, would acknowledge those present, not with casual conversation, but with controlled, deliberate gestures. Even this moment carried meaning, because being seen by the king even briefly could change a noble's entire future. A glance, a word, a smile. These were not small things, they were opportunities. And as the ritual continued, more people were allowed to enter. Doctors, barbers, valets, and officials gathered around. Each had a specific role. Each movement was expected, rehearsed, and repeated daily. The king would be handed his clothes piece by piece. A shirt, a robe, stockings, shoes. But here is where things began to feel uncomfortable. Because the king was not dressing himself. Others were doing it for him, in full view of the room. And not just anyone. Only nobles of the highest rank had the honor of handing the king certain items. To hold the king's sleeve, to present his shoes, to assist in dressing him. These were considered privileges. Imagine that, grown men of noble birth competing for the right to help the king get dressed. It sounds strange, but in this world it meant everything. Because proximity to the king meant influence, and influence meant survival in the dangerous world of court politics. But the routine did not stop there. As the king continued preparing himself, conversations began. Decisions were made. Requests were whispered. Political alliances formed and dissolved in the same room where the king had just woken up. There was no separation between private life and public power. Everything was intertwined. And then came the part that many modern observers find the most disturbing. The king's hygiene routine. In a time before modern plumbing, before daily bathing became common, cleanliness looked very different. The king did not bathe regularly in the way we might expect today. Instead, washing was often limited to hands and face, sometimes with scented cloths or alcohol-based solutions. Perfume was heavily used to mask odors, layers of it, because beneath the silk, the gold, and the carefully styled appearance, the reality of life in the palace was far less glamorous. Versailles itself, despite its beauty, struggled with sanitation. Chamber pots were common. Waste disposal was inconsistent. The sheer number of people living and visiting the palace created conditions that could quickly become unpleasant, and yet the routine continued. Every single day. Watch, observed, repeated. Why? Why would a king allow such intimate moments to become public displays? The answer lies in control. Louis XIV understood something crucial. Power is not just about force, it is about perception. By turning his daily life into a spectacle, He reminded everyone that he was the center of their world. Even his waking moments were events. Even his clothing choices mattered. Even his silence carried weight. Nothing was ordinary. Everything was theater. But this system did not begin with him. Earlier French kings had their own routines, their own traditions, their own ways of asserting authority. However, Louis XIV perfected it. He transformed daily life into a carefully managed performance, designed to keep the nobility under his control. Because while nobles competed for access to the king's morning routine, they were also being kept busy, distracted, contained. Instead of plotting rebellion in their own territories, they remained at court focused on gaining favor. It was brilliant and deeply unsettling. But not everyone saw it that way. Some nobles thrived in this environment. They learned the rules. They mastered the etiquette. They built influence through proximity. For them, the king's routine was not humiliating. It was opportunity. Others, however, found it suffocating. Imagine living in a world where every action is judged, where every moment is observed, where even your presence in a room depends on your status. A world where privacy barely exists. And yet, this was the reality of life at Versailles. But there is something even more revealing hidden within this daily ritual. Something that exposes the true nature of absolute power. Because while nobles competed for access, while servants performed their duties, while the king remained at the center of it all, one question lingered beneath the surface. Who truly controlled this system? Was it the king orchestrating every detail? Or had the system itself grown so powerful that even the king was bound by it? Because once a performance becomes expectation, it cannot easily stop. Everything was about to change. As the years passed, the routine grew more elaborate, more structured, more demanding. The number of participants increased. The rules became stricter, the symbolism more intense, and with it came pressure. Pressure on the king to maintain the image, pressure on the nobles to compete, pressure on the entire court to uphold a system that was both dazzling and deeply unnatural. But outside the walls of Versailles, France was changing, and not in ways that the morning rituals could control. Whispers of discontent began to spread. Economic struggles, social inequality, growing frustration among the people. While the king's mornings were filled with ceremony, the lives of ordinary citizens were filled with hardship. Two very different realities, moving further apart, and eventually those worlds would collide. But that moment was still to come. For now, the palace continued its routines. The king woke each morning surrounded by watchers. The rituals played out exactly as they had before. The illusion of control remained intact. Yet beneath the surface, cracks were forming. Because no matter how powerful a king appears, no system lasts forever. And the same rituals that once symbolized absolute control would one day become symbols of excess, of distance, of a ruler disconnected from his people. But that truth had not yet fully revealed itself. Not yet. Because before the fall there was still more to uncover. More secrets hidden behind the golden walls. More moments that would leave modern audiences stunned. And what happened next would reveal just how far this system had gone. The room was already full before the king had even fully opened his eyes. Soft footsteps echoed against polished floors as courtiers quietly slipped into position, each one aware that a single misstep, standing too close, speaking out of turn, even arriving at the wrong moment, could damage their standing at court. The air carried a mix of perfumes, wax candles, and something less pleasant lurking beneath it all. A reminder that behind the glittering image of royalty, reality was never as clean as it appeared. And at the center of it all lay Louis XIV, the Sun King, whose every movement was about to begin another carefully choreographed display of power. But what most people didn't realize was that even this king, who seemed to control everything, was slowly becoming trapped by the very system he had created. Because the morning ritual, the lever, was no longer just a routine. It had become an obligation. And obligations, even for kings, come with consequences. As attendants moved closer, the process continued with mechanical precision. A royal physician might step forward to briefly assess the king's health, often in front of everyone. Imagine that, your most personal condition discussed openly while dozens of eyes watched. The barber followed. Razors, cloths, and scented oils were prepared. The king's face was shaved carefully, every motion deliberate. A single mistake could mean punishment. A cut could mean disgrace. Yet the act itself, something most people would consider deeply private, was carried out under observation. No privacy, no escape, only performance. Then came the changing of garments, one of the most symbolic parts of the ritual. Layers of clothing were presented one by one. But not randomly, never randomly. Each item was handed over by a specific noble, depending on their rank. The highest-ranking individuals were granted the greatest honors: to pass the king his shirt, to assist with his sleeves, to present his coat. These actions, which today might seem trivial or even humiliating, were seen as marks of prestige, because proximity to the king meant visibility, and visibility meant power. But here's where the system reveals its darker side. This wasn't just about tradition, it was about control. Louis XIV had designed a world where the nobility depended entirely on him, not just for wealth or titles, but for relevance itself. By keeping them close, by making them compete for attention, he ensured they had little time or freedom to challenge his authority. And so every morning they returned, watching, waiting, competing, all for a moment of recognition. But beneath the surface, something else was happening, something far less glamorous. Because while the king was being dressed in layers of silk and gold, while perfumes were applied to mask unpleasant odors, the reality of hygiene in 17th century France remained deeply uncomfortable. Bathing, as we understand it today, was rare. There was a widespread belief at the time that frequent bathing could actually harm the body by opening pores to disease. Instead, cleanliness was maintained through changing clothes, applying perfumes, and occasional surface washing. The result: a world where appearances mattered far more than actual cleanliness. Heavy perfumes filled the parlous air, attempting to cover what could not truly be removed. Fabrics absorbed sweat, rooms retained smells, and with hundreds, sometimes thousands, of people moving through Versailles daily, maintaining hygiene became nearly impossible. Yet the illusion remained intact. From a distance, everything looked perfect. Up close, it was a different story. And still the rituals continued. After dressing, the king would often proceed to breakfast, again not alone. Selected individuals could remain present, watching as he ate, sometimes even speaking with him. Meals were not just about nourishment, they were political arenas. A word spoken at the table could change a career. A glance could signal favor or disapproval. Nothing was casual. Everything mattered. And as the morning progressed, the king would move into his official duties. Meetings, decisions, discussions about war, finance, and governance, all conducted with the same underlying principle: visibility, control, performance. But here is the hidden truth that many at the time did not fully realize. The system that elevated the king was also isolating him. Because when every interaction is staged, when every word is calculated, when every moment is observed, genuine human connection begins to disappear. Who could the king trust? Who spoke honestly? Who saw him as a person and not just a source of power? These questions lingered quietly beneath the surface of court life. And over time, they became more difficult to ignore, because outside the palace walls, reality was very different. While nobles competed for attention in gilded rooms, ordinary people struggled with rising taxes, food shortages, and economic pressure. The wealth displayed at Versailles stood in sharp contrast to the conditions experienced by much of the population. Two worlds, one filled with luxury and ritual, the other with hardship and uncertainty, and the distance between them was growing. But inside the palace, the routine remained unchanged. Morning after morning, the same rituals played out, the same faces appeared, the same performances unfolded, until something shifted, not suddenly, not dramatically, but gradually, because systems like this don't collapse overnight. They weaken, they strain, they reveal cracks. And one of the first signs of that strain was subtle, almost invisible: fatigue. Not just physical fatigue, but emotional exhaustion, for the king, for the courtiers, for everyone trapped within the endless cycle of observation and expectation. Because maintaining perfection is exhausting, and perfection was exactly what this system demanded, every day, without fail. But perfection is an illusion, and illusions eventually begin to fade. The later years of Louis XIV's reign were marked by challenges: wars that drained resources, economic strain that affected the country, and a growing sense that the glittering image of Versailles could not fully hide the underlying problems. Yet the rituals continued, because by this point they had to. They were no longer just displays of power, they were symbols of a system that defined an entire era. But symbols can become burdens, and burdens, if carried long enough, can break even the strongest structures. The question was no longer whether change would come, it was when, and how. Because what began as a display of control would one day be remembered as something else entirely: a warning, a glimpse into what happens when power becomes detached from reality, when rulers become performers, when appearances matter more than truth, and when a system designed to control others begins to control itself. But the most shocking part of this story is still ahead, because what followed would not just affect a king, it would shake an entire nation, and leave a legacy that history would never forget. The rituals did not stop. even as the world beyond the palace walls began to shift in ways no ceremony could control. Morning after morning, the same doors opened, the same courtiers entered, the same performance unfolded around Louis XIV. The system he had built was so deeply ingrained that it continued almost automatically, like a machine that no one dared to turn off. But machines, no matter how powerful, eventually wear down, and so did this one. As the years passed, the grandeur of Versailles remained dazzling, but beneath the surface it was beginning to rot in ways that were not immediately visible. The perfumes grew stronger, the crowds grew larger, the routines became more rigid, and the gap between appearance and reality widened with each passing day, because while the king's morning still appeared magnificent, the truth was becoming harder to hide. Versailles was overcrowded. Hundreds of nobles, servants, guards, and visitors moved through its halls constantly. Space was limited, and proper sanitation was nearly impossible to maintain. Chamber pots were used frequently, sometimes emptied carelessly, sometimes left too long. Corridors that once gleamed with polished surfaces could carry unpleasant odors that no amount of perfume could fully disguise. And yet no one spoke of it openly, because to acknowledge it would be to break the illusion. And the illusion was everything. It was what kept the system alive. It was what maintained the king's image. It was what allowed power to continue flowing in the same direction. But illusions are fragile, and cracks were beginning to show. By the time Louis XIV reached the later stages of his life, the weight of decades of rule had begun to take its toll. His health declined, his energy faded, yet the expectations remained exactly the same. He still had to wake before an audience. He still had to perform the ritual. He still had to embody the image of absolute power, even when his body resisted, even when exhaustion set in, even when the reality of age could no longer be hidden. And in those moments, something quietly shifted, because the same nobles who once admired the king's strength now saw his vulnerability. The same routine that once projected control now revealed limitation. The performance was no longer perfect, and once perfection begins to fade, perception begins to change. But the most significant transformation was not happening inside the palace. It was happening outside. Because while Versailles remained locked in its rituals, France itself was evolving. New ideas were spreading. Philosophers began questioning authority, tradition, and the very nature of power. Writers and thinkers challenged the idea that kings ruled by divine right. They asked dangerous questions. Why should one man hold absolute control? Why should privilege be determined by birth? Why should ordinary people suffer while the court lived in luxury? These ideas did not immediately destroy the system, but they planted seeds that would grow, slowly, until they could no longer be ignored. Meanwhile, the royal routines continued to be passed down. After Louis XIV, his successors inherited not only the throne, but the system itself. The elaborate ceremonies, the structured mournings, the obsession with visibility and control, they all remained. But something had changed. Because what once inspired awe now began to invite criticism. What once symbolized power now looked like excess. What once demonstrated control now seemed disconnected from reality. And the people of France were beginning to notice. The contrast was impossible to ignore. On one side, a palace filled with gold, silk, and endless ceremony. On the other, a nation struggling with economic hardship, inequality, and growing frustration. Two worlds moving in opposite directions. And eventually they would collide. Everything was about to change. The final decades of the monarchy before the great upheaval were marked by increasing tension. Financial crisis strained the government. Poor harvests led to rising food prices. Discontent spread among the population, and still the rituals continued. Kings woke before audiences. Courtiers competed for attention. Perfumes masked the air. The performance went on. But fewer people believed in it, because once people begin to see through an illusion, it loses its power. And when that happens, even the strongest systems can fall. The later French monarchy would eventually face a moment of reckoning that no amount of ceremony could prevent. The same structures that once maintained control would prove unable to adapt to a changing world. And when the collapse came, it would be dramatic, unstoppable, historic. But long before that moment, the warning signs were already there. In the quiet discomfort of overcrowded halls, in the forced smiles of exhausted courtiers, in the fading strength of a king who could no longer fully sustain the image he had created, and most of all in the strange, unsettling reality of a morning routine that revealed far more than it was meant to hide. Because what seemed like a simple act, waking up, getting dressed, preparing for the day, had become something else entirely. A symbol, a system, a spectacle, one that exposed the true nature of absolute power. It showed how control can be maintained not just through force, but through ritual, how influence can be shaped not just through decisions, but through visibility, and how even the most private moments can be transformed into tools of authority. But it also revealed something deeper, something more human, because behind the layers of silk and gold, behind the crowds and ceremonies, behind the carefully constructed image of perfection, there was still a person, a man bound by expectations, a ruler trapped within his own system, a king who could not escape the performance. And that may be the most revealing truth of all. Power, when taken to its extreme, does not just control others, it controls everything, even the one who holds it. And as history would soon prove, no matter how powerful a system appears, no matter how perfect the illusion seems, nothing lasts forever. Not even kings, not even empires, not even the rituals that once defined them. Because in the end, reality always finds a way to break through. And when it does, everything changes.